Who is the next global superpower? For many people, there isn't a next. The United States always has been and will be the global leader. Now, the US has not been challenged for over 8 decades, apart from perhaps the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Many people believe that if there is going to be a future challenger, it must be China, a country that is already one of the world's largest in both economic and military terms. But what if the notion of a single superpower nation is now outdated? The way that the geopolitical order is shaping up, it appears that alliances and not a single country will rule the world one day in the near future. This has become a very real prospect in recent months, with the BRICS nations seemingly ramping up their efforts to organize, expand, and solidify their status with one single mission: to establish a new global order and in the process dismantle the existing Western-based system. Now, not all in the West are taking BRICS that seriously. The nations are viewed by some as a loose economic alliance, comprised of powers that could never realistically coexist and cooperate with one another. There may be some truth to that, but if you paid any attention to the BRICS summit in South Africa in August 2023, the balance of power may have begun tilting away from the West. The addition of Saudi Arabia to BRICS, for example, one of the world's largest producing nations of oil, is a huge loss for the West, and the US specifically, while being a monumental gain for BRICS. Western nations now can no longer ignore the noise and must ask the question: is BRICS the next global superpower? Let's answer that. To understand whether BRICS can be a superpower or not, you must first understand what it is. BRICS is an acronym representing the economic alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That sounds impressive, but its origins are quite humble. The idea was not proposed by any of the member countries, but rather the term BRICS was coined by a Goldman Sachs economist, Jim O'Neill. In a report published by Goldman Sachs and O'Neill in 2001, the world first heard of the concept of BRIC. Yes, it was BRIC back then, as at the time the S, South Africa, was excluded. The report predicted that one day the combined economies of Brazil, Russia, India, and China would surpass the growth of established Western economies. That report was published over 2 decades ago and predicted that in 2039, this would be the year that the BRICS nations eclipsed the West in economic growth. At the time of its publications, nobody knew that within just a few years, these countries would decide to use the report as a blueprint to base their economic future on. In 2009, BRIC nations arranged their first summit, and in 2010, they added South Africa and became what we know today as BRICS. However, it was still early days, and the alliance was seen by many as it is today, a loose economic pact with some trade agreements. Fast forward 13 years from then, and BRICS is a different animal. After the Russia-Ukraine war began in 2021, countries around the world started picking sides. Either they could side with the West, led by the United States, and sanction Russia. If they didn't, however, in the eyes of the West, they were a Russian ally. History may view this as the catalyst that caused China and Russia to define and redefine BRICS and its purpose. Until then, the G7 nations, an economic alliance including Canada, France, Italy, Germany, the US, Japan, the UK, and the EU, was unrivaled on the global stage. BRICS has never, at least outwardly, signaled any intention to challenge Western dominance in either international politics or economically. But we know that any crisis accelerates the pace of change. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. China and Russia decided to lead the evolution of BRICS, and expansion was a major focus of this plan. If we roll back the clock to 1995, the G7 nations accounted for 44.9% of global GDP, while countries that are now part of BRICS stood at only 16.9%. 15 years later, in 2010, G7 nations had shrank, with their GDP percentage accounting for 34.3%, while that of BRICS had risen to 26.6%. That's not bad for a, quote, loose economic alliance. Today, however, the G7 nations account for 29.9% of global GDP, and the BRICS nations have surpassed it, accounting for 32.1%. Within 27 years, BRICS has changed the entire economic equation. The idea that BRICS may become a power to be reckoned with in the distant future or down the line evaporates when you read these stats. They have already arrived. If we talk about GDP alone, recent reports suggest that BRICS already holds the distinction of being the world's largest collective contributor to gross domestic product, and this growth is only going to continue. From its humble beginnings as a concept in a Goldman Sachs report, BRICS has proven itself as a global economic player. It is no surprise that many analysts believe BRICS might birth a new financial order, dumping the dollar and the West-led financial institutions who have reigned over the world for almost 8 decades. That all started in Bretton Woods in 1944, an agreement that established the US dollar as the international reserve currency. Since then, the United States has effectively ruled the world. Post-World War II, all countries had to use the dollar, which was backed by gold at the time. Yes, Nixon did take the US dollar off the gold standard in the 1970s, but that was quickly replaced by petrol, creating what we now know today as the petrodollar. Issuing the world reserve currency offered the US unimaginable privilege. As every country needed dollars, the United States could print massive quantities of currency out of thin air without worrying about local inflation. This is the way the world has operated for the last 8 decades. However, things took an unexpected turn 2 years ago, which sent shockwaves throughout the dollar-based financial system. After the Russia-Ukraine invasion, the United States seized Russian assets and accounts that were held with them denominated in US dollars. This move put the world on alert. The US dollar is a weapon that could be used to devastating effect. If Russian dollars can be seized, so can everyone else's. You see, countries holding dollars were now and always have been dependent on the United States. Demand for a currency strengthens it and helps to maintain and increase its value. The existing global order guarantees demand for the US dollar. As we have covered, BRICS are now a greater economic superpower to the US and G7 nations. They actually realized this some time ago and began laying the foundations to an alternative to the Western-led financial system that we have today. Their first step was to develop a new bank. They had developed the New Development Bank, often called the BRICS Bank, which holds reserves equal to 50 billion US dollars. This not only challenged institutions like the IMF and World Bank, but also the SWIFT system. This is the global network of payments that was used to freeze out countries like Russia and Iran from international trade. Many developing countries are now turning to BRICS and the New Development Bank as they feel it offers a better alternative to the US-based system, be it from the US themselves, the IMF, or the World Bank. Now, the move away from the West to many developing nations is the most attractive element of BRICS. They may no longer want to ally with the West, not necessarily because they agreed with the West, but because prior to BRICS, they had no choice. The world was unipolar, and going against the US at any period in the last 80 years meant geopolitical and economical death. Developing nations in Asia, South America, and Africa believe that they can join and trade with other nations without fear of being exploited or sanctioned as they have been under the existing US-led system. As many as 40 nations have expressed interest in joining the expanding organization now known as BRICS+, and it was announced just recently in the summit in South Africa, 6 countries have been invited to join BRICS+: Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Don't forget that Saudi Arabia is an oil-rich and leading member of OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries. You should also note that over 80% of oil reserves are located in OPEC countries, which, after accounting for Iran's 12%, becomes 92% of the world's global oil reserves. Saudi Arabian and OPEC oil is what backs the US dollar. Now that they have sided with a competitor and begun trading oil in alternative currencies, what does this mean for the US? Well, this means that when Saudi Arabia and Iran join BRICS, which they will officially do so soon, BRICS will control 92% of global oil reserves. Having Saudi Arabia on its side means BRICS could, in theory, birth a new financial system, the same way the US did in the 70s by using Saudi Arabian oil to trade with and back the petrodollar. This is why you are hearing the term de-dollarization everywhere. Now, de-dollarization means countries around the world are giving up on either having dollars in their reserves or using them in international trade. Saudi Arabia has already started selling oil to China in yuan, and India has conducted a similar transaction using the rupee. Now, as if the deck isn't already stacked against the US, the Chinese yuan has also outpaced the dollar and has become the world's most used currency for cross-border transactions. And at the same time, China is moving away from the US dollar and US dollar reserves and has begun buying up precious metals, both silver and gold. Many questioned for the last few years as to why reserves of gold and silver were disappearing off international exchanges, but reputable sources such as Bloomberg have pointed to the fact that China and other BRICS nations have been the ones buying up these precious commodities. It should be quite clear now that BRICS has all the ingredients to become a superpower. A country has to be economically, militarily, and politically strong to qualify as a superpower. And we now know a country can now also be an alliance of various different countries. When we apply this to BRICS, we see that it has surpassed the G7's economic growth, and its member countries like China are more active than ever in international politics and in some military maneuvers. We know that Russia and China together can challenge the West's and NATO forces, and unfortunately we are seeing that play out right now. However, as warfare dynamics have changed since World War II. Some hope that it is unlikely BRICS will need to become a military alliance to replace the Western-led global order. BRICS has everything in terms of GDP output, precious metal reserves, military power, and support from oil-producing nations. These are all the factors that led the US to rise as the global superpower, and BRICS may repeat that feat in the coming decades. I'll leave you to consider that thought. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video to the end. As a small creator, I really appreciate the support. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like these, and we will see you next time.